Thanks for joining us this afternoon, everyone, for our first live learning for the year. We're super pumped to have what I know is going to be a pretty dynamic conversation for you today. My name's Nick Dyson. I'm the founder and CEO of Future Anything. And these conversations, I love to treat them as provocations. Let's sort of see where the conversation takes us. At the beginning, you'll find we'll have a bit of a chat, and I've got some questions for our guests to dig into. But then for this particular one, I want to kind of leave a fair bit of time for questions from you. So get prepared to be able to throw a curly question at the room as well, so that we can dig into the things that you're wondering at the moment as well. Before we get started, I just want to take the time to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we live, work, play, learn, and create. I often start by showing, two maps. The first map being the map of Australia we're all really familiar with, and then the second map being a map of our Indigenous Australia and the fabric that kind of makes up our land. And I actually started a workshop yesterday in Yeppoon with those two maps. And I asked the teachers in the room what the gap was between seeing the first map and the second map, and it was decades. But then the 97 year 7, 8 and 9 students that I had in the room, I asked what the gap was between the first map and the second map, and they all sort of identified only a couple of years difference. And I thought, gosh, what a beautiful legacy of education to know that the gap between what we know as, I guess, Australia and our greater understanding of our First Nations people, that we are starting to bridge the gap between those two things. So I'm coming to you up in Queensland at the moment. I'd love to know where you're joining us from. So if you could jump into the chat, introduce yourself, maybe drop in a curly question or a curiosity that you've got today. And I'd also love for you to let us know what Indigenous land you're on today and where you're joining us from as well. It'd be great to kind of see. This has been one of our biggest registered live learning events. We had over 170 people jump in for today's event. So a giant number of educators from near and far that are really curious about obviously this provocation around disruption and where education is going. We're recording today's live learning, so we'll be sure to send this tasty morsel out to those that can't join us live. And also, if you just totally love the experience, you can grab a glass of wine later and just nerd out on rewatching all of this all over again. So I will get started, and I want to introduce, we've got Jan here. We're just waiting for Peter to join us, but Jan, no stranger to live learning. This is your second official drop-in to visit us, and I'm always so appreciative of how generous you are with your time and in trying to reshape education and also support the work that we do. You're coming to us a little bit jet lagged from an overseas trip. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the moment. What's taking up your time and taking up your space and really, I guess, driving you at this point in time?
Well, hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. I see lots of familiar faces. Great to see so many of you as we head into 2023. I've been saying Happy New Year to people, but I've just got to stop that. Just because when I see people, I'm like, Happy New Year. They're like, we're so far into the year, Jan, stop talking. I am coming to you from Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung countries of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, and I would love to pay my respects to elders past and present. And thank you, Nick, for your acknowledgement as well. What have I been working on? Well, over the last couple of years, I've been working on this alliance that many of you here have been involved in called Learning Creates Australia, where we're trying to look at how we might reimagine senior secondary school, particularly as a starting point with different forms of recognition of learning. So if we were to get beyond the ATAR, which is definitely rapidly happening, what would that look like and what might we need to build to replace that? So we've been working with ARC at Melbourne Uni, Sandra Milligan, many of you know, and my co-chairs at Learning Creates Australia are Hayley Maguire from National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition and Tony Mackay. So both people very well known to many of you as well. So that work has been pretty dominant, Nick. But I also get to work in a bunch of other areas, which I think really supports my thinking actually about education and the future of learning. So one of my areas that I guess I've kind of become much more known for because of the work that I did back in my days at FYA, Foundation for Young Australians, is the future of work. And I'm still very, very involved in that. And that's a really core part of a lot of what I do. I've been on the World Economic Forum Council on Future of Skills and Education for the past few years. And also I'm kind of very regularly in schools working and speaking with educators, but also often with parents and also in business talking about the future of work. So that's a really great one. And then there's just a bunch of other things that I'm very interested in and working on, which is everything from AI and technology through to things like, you know, how we're all going to live together in an environment where we've got aging populations. So I'm very interested in well-being beyond just sort of mental health, but actually health and well-being for whole populations groups. So pretty broad, Nick. I've got quite a big portfolio of things that I'm thinking about, writing about, talking to people about, and kind of consulting on, but also leading on a bunch of different projects.
Very diverse. You've used a word that I'm going to dig into a little bit. It's actually an acronym, and I think we will start here because it's obviously just blowing up LinkedIn and every social space when it comes to education. We're going to talk about AI just for a moment. We're going to get this big curly thing out of the way. I was working with a school recently, talking to their whole staff about kind of where the future of education is going, using some of that beautiful data from FYA days and obviously bringing in some of the new research. And I shared this screen recording of me nerding out on ChatGPT, really going back to my roots as a senior English teacher. And I asked ChatGPT to write me an analytical essay, of course, on one of the themes from Macbeth. I mean, we've all got fond memories of those days, obviously. And look, it started churning out this essay. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to level it up a bit.
There you go.
Can you make sure that there's an introduction, 3 body paragraphs,
now listen,
and then a conclusion?
You stay on the grass.
You make
you
sure.
go anywhere near the road. Are you listening?
This is very special.
Christy's still got her
hold on.
her volume on. All good, Christy. Road safety is really important. So then it started bringing out the ChatGPT. I said, look, let's make sure it's got an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. Can you quote, from the text to support your answers? Then I leveled it up and said, look, can you throw in 3 grammatical errors and 3 spelling errors as well? I don't want it to be perfect because then my teacher will know that obviously ChatGPT has created it and regenerated. And I kept sort of adding to it, and it was doing it so quickly. And the provocation that I sort of placed to the staff was, if the AI can complete the assessment, then it's time for a reformation around our assessment tasks. The question is, if the AI can complete it, then we haven't evolved our assessment path where it needs to be. And I threw the provocation to the team and I was like, what if we personalize that task? What if we ask the AI, or the student to complete an essay, but instead of just quoting from the text, they had to use experiences that had happened in their life and how themes from Macbeth had actually shown up in their recent lived experience? Or what if we asked them to find a newspaper article from their local community from the last 4 weeks and show how one of the themes from Macbeth was showing up in their local suburb? Like, I think these are the evolutions that we should be considering around AI. But the response from the team, I think coming from a place of fear, was, well, we just have to go back to exams. In-class exams, we'll lock the resourcing down, because if we do that, we know that it's the students completing the work and we won't have anything to worry about. What are your thoughts, Jan? Like, obviously there's a bit of fear attached to the technology, I think, for teachers, but I mean, my belief is that this is the reformation that we need for assessment. In all the work that you're doing, what's your thinking on AI?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, I also want to give people some pointers around who they should be following and listening to. So Dr. Katrina Wallace, who's probably one of the leading voices in Australia on responsible AI, and has been very, very, very vocal. Very, very good friend of mine, excellent provocateur, but also has done an enormous amount of research. And she's the one actually that's driven the government to get the federal government to kind of get organised and start thinking about what we might need to be putting in place around responsible AI, the metaverse, all of the kind of elements that are coming together and the new technology that's just pouring. And she's basically says just it's a tsunami now. It's like the gates have been opened. So she wrote a book with a couple of other people from Sydney Uni called Checkmate Humanity, which got launched, I think, at the end of last year. So if you want to be looking at people on LinkedIn and people who are kind of really being very clear about what's going on and not trying to, she doesn't own or run a tech company. So she's not trying to push a particular line. She doesn't own, a drone company. But she's extremely, I think, tuned into what's going on. So I really recommend following Kat. And then I think a lot of things actually, Nick, I think that number one, it's absolutely pointless, like in every other situation in history till now where some new technology comes in and you try to ban it, it's genuinely absolutely pointless, and it's never ever worked. So why would it work now? The housemaids that went on strike when the washing machine came into play in the 19th century, went on strike, and all the housemaids and walked up and down the streets and were protesting, all the way through to people who very recently said, mobile phones should not be anywhere near anybody in any context that's to do with learning, and calculators when I was at school. None of those things have ever worked. In fact, what we've done is we have actually genuinely embraced all of those things, and they've actually many, many, many times made our lives better. I think the issue with AI is that, and the rapid integration of AI is a big question about how ubiquitous it is and how much we can kind of manage the speed of it coming into our lives in every single area. But I do agree that to me, actually more than COVID, and I thought COVID was actually going to be the really big transformational moment for education and learning, but actually, interestingly, I think it's the technology that is going to be the biggest transformation. And as you rightly say, if we are reliant on a written assessment for how we understand what young people know and can do, then honestly, I feel like it's kind of on us that we've missed the opportunity to extend and understand much more about how we think about how young people can show us what they know and can do in a variety of forms, in a variety of different ways. So it's definitely a wake-up call. My ChatGPT story of the week, and I've been using ChatGPT since last October. I happen to have a high-tech child in my family who just about saw it when it was just rolled off the OpenAI platform. My ChatGPT story was I asked ChatGPT to if ChatGPT could experience love, and if ChatGPT could love me, and ChatGPT came back and said, I don't have the emotions of a human. So I'm actually unable to go there with you. I'm really sorry. I feel really sorry about it. And it actually responded in an emotionally human way to my question about can you love me, which I thought was very interesting. But on the upside, I've written 3 business plans in the last month that would have taken me about a week each to write, which ChatGPT and I together in unison have written in about 3 hours. I've written about 14 job descriptions in the last couple of months. That ChatGPT for me is my best final draft that I'll ever get. So it is definitely extremely useful in business. So I just think we're in a very, very interesting time of rapid technological change.
Yeah, I think, look, now I'm going to have to ask ChatGPT if it can love me. I think this will be my key takeaway is now I need to ask that question. I was writing a blog article recently and I've been using it to help me start my writing to generate like that little bit of inspiration. And once I'd written my blog, I then popped it in, but asked ChatGPT to rewrite it in the tone of Sir Ken Robinson. And I got this beautiful piece of writing that Sir Ken could have delivered. And then I had it rewrite it in the tone of Martin Luther King. And I have a dream speech that I could deliver. And so I think even the opportunity for us to explore how this technology might firstly alleviate some of the administrative load that educators have at the moment. And secondly, I think really lean into how we can support our young people to have deeper critical thinking skills with the application of this knowledge. And I've seen a couple of schools that are certainly not are not banning it, but are actually using it and are asking their students to just quote the source as they would any other source that they were using for their assessment. And so it becomes a part of their bibliography and their references within the tasks that they're putting in together. I'm curious, Jan, about what you like, where you see, and I think your question around what's the purpose of assessment. And I think my question has been to educators that I've been working with this year, when we look at assessment, what do we want for our young people rather than what do we want from? And I think that really important shift in language when we look at the purpose and intention behind the assessment instruments that we're creating for our young people. Tell me about some of the curious or innovative ways that you've seen schools maybe approach assessment, particularly maybe with the lens around skills and capabilities that, I know is so important for young people.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the tools we've had for a long time, actually, Nick, and if Peter was here, he'd be talking about Tom Markin's work and, PBL and all of those tools that we've had at hand, I think that have been used almost as an adjunct come into the main game now. I think it will be actually very, very interesting to see how people how we do incorporate technology. One of the best stories that I tell often, which lots of people here might have heard as well, but I always think about this group of young people who are on the north coast of New South Wales, and it was led by a First Nations young woman, and the school was doing a program which was all about land and sea management, and it was basically a kind of a tripartite program with the TAFE, with the CSIRO, actually Westpac got involved as well. And so these students were offered the opportunity to do a project on land and sea management. And so they went to their elders and they said, what do you think about us kind of using new tech? And we've got this drone technology to go sort of far beyond what we could normally see with the human eye, but we can collect data and information that will be fed to CSIRO, and then it will help us with our land and sea management. And the elders said, that sounds fantastic. And these one young woman and then 8 others became Australia's first ever Indigenous drone rangers and kind of got qualified as that. And I just thought that was so powerful because, number one, for them, those young people spoke about this incredibly purposeful and meaningful work for their community. This is a country that has been looked after for 60,000 years by First Nations people. And then, of course, the kind of getting new skills and new tech and being at the front end of that actually through this process, like being the first movers in Australia as young people. So I can just see these incredible opportunities, but it does open up the question, which is the question we've always had about how far can we kind of fling open the doors and the windows and the gates and the fences around our schools to genuinely get engaged in doing things that are meaningful to communities and meaningful to young people, but also serve society more broadly. And I think just the intersection of that is what is probably one of the most powerful things. And it kind of doesn't matter which tech it is or whether it's a PBL or whether it's an entrepreneurship program, aka Future Anything, Nick. I think all of those tools are things that now, through our work with Sandra, Milligan and the team at the Australian Research Centre, we're working out ways to assess all of those skills and capabilities, and they're not added extras and they're not extracurricular, they're actually core to learning.
Yeah, I think that's a really important element, right? Because sometimes this stuff is always sat on the outside. So when we've looked at these critical skills and capabilities, they've always been the nice to haves that sit outside this foundational focus on knowledge. And the reality is, if knowledge can be created by AI, and if we know that that's where the world of work will ask that to move, then how do we actually build the capability of our young people to have the skills and dispositions that they need to do the new work order, the work that will exist outside of what AI will take over? I'm curious to understand a little bit more of how some of the schools are playing with those skills and capabilities in the classroom. So what does it look like on the ground for schools to integrate? Because I think you're right, there's lots of pedagogical approaches. We can look at project-based learning, entrepreneurship education, entrepreneurial pedagogy, design thinking. Like there's a lot of modalities. Critical to understand that all of those are different, and you can certainly blend them, but each pedagogy has a different purpose in the classroom. I think these provide a vehicle, but how do you actually really purposefully build in that skill building underneath that as well?
Well, I think the tools that we're looking at developing right now, and I don't know if anybody's here from, I'm sure there is people on from South Australia, but I'm super impressed with what SACE are doing. So kind of this integrated learner profile, which starts to genuinely help us think about assessment in a very different way, and also gives young people and students, not just young people, but students, parents, the kind of tools to also think about the learning. I think this whole idea that, this is something that's done to you, your assessment. I think this idea that you own your learning, that you own the progression of it, that it's embedded in the way that and that learner profiles enable you to. There's a lot of learner profiles, of course, because we've also got New South Wales is developing one. So we're in a quite, lots of people I'm sure here will agree, we're going to be in quite a interesting stage over the next few years, probably this decade, where there's going to be lots of iterations and lots of versions of these tools. But I think the point, Nick, is that you do need to have that kind of framework that you can utilize then to bring all of these, whatever those pedagogies are, whatever the modalities are, to play. And I think that the learner profile is a really great start, and I can see it happening. See, lots of schools have been trialing it and doing different versions of it. I think that the psychometric work that ARC are doing is particularly interesting and important, because I think it just gives another perspective on the learner profile. So I would watch that work. There's a bunch of schools and the new metric schools around the country. Again, there's probably a bunch of them here. I can see quite a few people actually here who are in those schools, and they would have a lot to say. I'm keen to hear what you all think about that work and how it's going. But we want to see this done extremely carefully and with very strong methodological and evidence base built into it.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point. Our next live learning, we're actually diving into learner profiles as well, so more on that space. We've been, in our work, been really focused on looking at those skills in quite a lot of detail across both our students and teachers. And so we've been focusing on 6 critical skills that we've been benchmarking in our program, and then post-program testing. What's been quite fascinating in this work, that it doesn't matter what school we're working in, what system, what age or stage the young people are at. When we look at the skills of adaptive mindset, so feedback and resilience, when we look at the skills of creativity and innovation, project management, we don't call it group work, we call it project management, communication, critical thinking and problem solving, by far and away the skill that is the lowest in every classroom is creativity and innovation, and always by a significant margin. So our young people and our educators, our young people report confidence of maybe between 60 and 80% across the other capabilities. But in creativity and innovation, the capability is always sometimes as much as 20 or 30% lower. It'll be no surprise to the educators in the room that if the young people show, a lack of confidence in a particular capability, then that is mirrored in the staff as well, because you can't teach something that you don't feel confident in at the same time. So in thinking about these learner profiles and these skills and capability building, I think maybe the critical conversation we need to be having is how schools and school leaders can be supporting their staff to build the capacity that they need to navigate some of these critical pedagogies, to understand how to teach the skills just as well as we teach the knowledge. Because without building the capability of our staff, we're not going to see those flow-on effects in our classrooms. What kind of work, I guess, is happening in that space as well, Jan, or what are you seeing as around that capacity building and that professional learning space for teachers?
Yeah, so I think this is fascinating, because one of the things that, of course, happens throughout all of this kind of school system is this, you know, very stressful environment that we've also just come out of course, with COVID. So there's quite a bit of PTSD, I think, floating around. So I'm very keen to hear actually as well about how people are emerging out of that. But what we do know, and I think it's this mindset actually, Nick, is that wherever I see educators with a learning mindset themselves, everything's better. So we're all lifelong learners. In fact, in one of the 6, you know, there's 6 really, really key elements of the future of work. Way back when we did the reports for FYA, we only actually had 3, but actually there's 6 now, which really tells you a lot about how the world has changed, even in the last 5 or 6 years. And one of them is this idea of lifelong learning. And this has always rolled off the tongue for us in education, but actually that genuine ability to find the space, the headspace, the mindset, and the opportunity for lifelong learning seems to me to be one of the most predominant themes in the future of work. And if we think about education and educators as a workplace, then that also applies. So how do we build in the capacity, the time, the thinking, the headspace for ongoing and constant learning, and not just learning at a point in time, you know, like I've got to learn something quickly because I've got to teach it or talk it through or run a project on it, but actually what are we thinking about around the learning that an educator would need to be doing over their lifetime. So just in the same way that in many other sectors, whether it's health or engineering or other places, even apparently I found this out from a friend who's a pilot, even a pilot who doesn't seem to do much anymore actually with planes, even they have to go every 6 months and get an upgrade in terms of technology, but also information, knowledge, and learning. So, you know, what's the system upgrade that we're getting and that we're giving to educators? Where is it? How is it working? It seems to me that we're still, unless you go off and choose to do something very formal like a master's, it seems to me it's pretty hit and miss in terms of professional development and how and where it comes from and where it comes into the school system, or whether you individually. I'm fascinated by the fact that Learn on TikTok, which is a subgroup of TikTok, there's like 45 million connections. So there's a lot of people learning in a lot of different contexts. Apparently a lot of those people are educators. So who knows what's, you know, genuinely going on, but that idea that we're lifelong learners and how do we think about that as educators, I think is a really powerful. And as you know, I've always said, I refuse to use the word teacher. I stopped using the word teacher about 3 or 4 years ago, because teaching is a very tiny percentage actually of what an educator does today. They're doing as much curation, brokering, coaching, mentoring, teaching, learning as they are teaching in and of itself. So I feel like it's a really, really powerful idea that actually the educator is such an important role now and into the future, particularly in this kind of ubiquitous world that we're in, where I just read another report today on, you know, truth and disinformation out of Europe, and it was very, I don't know, compelling what people in those countries, particularly countries that are in the middle of this war, are feeling about truth and information disinformation.
Mm, that's so interesting. And I think, really critical for us to think about as for those that are in the room, particularly as school leaders, like how do you create the culture, or how do you create the systems and the processes that enable a culture of lifelong learning to emerge within your school? So specifically, if you want, and I often, ask teachers at the beginning of a year, like imagine that I've brought all of the young people together that you've taught across the course of the year, and you're not in the room yet. And I say to them, what's one word that would describe learning with Miss or Mr.? What would be the word that you would want them to say? I think I would also stretch that conversation to principals and other school leadership teams. If all the staff that worked with you were in a room and I walked up to them and I said, tell me about the culture at your school and tell me what it's like to be an educator in this space, what kind of words would you want them to use to describe the environment that you're setting up for both your teachers and your students? And then whatever that word is, if it's fun, if it's safe, if it's innovative, if it's creative, if it's, future ready, if it's forward thinking, if it's, we move fast and break things, like whatever it is that you want to use to describe that, specifically, what are the processes or systems or things that you do that make that happen within your school? How do you start your staff meetings, and does it lean into the word that you've chosen? What do your emails look like that you send to staff? What does your newsletter look like? When you walk around the school, how do you speak to the staff that you meet? When you have your line management meetings, like what's the structure of those line management meetings and how do they lean into that intention? Because I think it's really easy to say, yes, we have a culture of lifelong learning in our school, but specifically tell me what's happening within the school that's creating that, and speak into those very deliberate and purposeful things that you are doing in your school that make that a reality for the people that are living in it. I'd love to grab some questions from the room. We've got about 10 minutes left. So you're welcome to obviously throw your microphone on and speak into it, or you're also welcome to drop 1,000 questions into the bottom, because I could definitely talk to Jan for the next 2 hours and just pick her brain. If you don't put questions in, I definitely will. But
can I just say something about that last point that you made? Because I love that, Nick. I revisited this year Atomic Habits by James Clear, which is obviously I think it's one of the best-selling books in history. But I just think that idea that this compounded, it's like the compounded impact of very small, you change sort of the 1%. You don't have to change. And I think this was such a message for everyone in the world out of this book. I mean, every book's got one key message, which makes you wonder about the other 500 pages. But anyway, the idea that, you just change 1% and that compounds over time. And so, yeah, it is to your point, what's the 1% that you're going to shift or change as a school community? And I do like to think of this about a school community. I know that you spoke about like the profession and the staff, but I think some of the best work that we will do over the next few years, and some of the best work that's been done in the past, and again by people in this call, because I can see lots of people here who I know, is where actually we've genuinely worked very hard at some experiments, including some that haven't worked and some have failed, but also some experiments where actually parents, students, educators have got together, and including school administrators. And we did some work in South Australia last year with Heathfield, with Roy Page, where we actually got the students to lead a project, but it was an intergenerational cross-school everyone project about kind of the kind of culture and where the school was at and where the school wanted to be. And it was just powerfully profound. When you start to survey the different, which these young people did, survey the different parts of the school, students, educators, how the views of the school were just so broad and diverse. And I feel like that's the starting point. Like if you can't get that information and have that conversation, then I think it's going to be very, very difficult to have that really inclusive and really powerful learning community, which is actually what we need. So yeah, I think there's lots of great work going on that help us on that road, and plenty of tools and examples.
Yeah, I think that 1% is really interesting. I've been playing with this idea that if you were to choose like a hinge capability that you want to focus on in your classroom, all you need is 100 minutes a term. Like, so if you allocated 10 minutes a week on a focused activity that explicitly builds your chosen capability, which could be creativity or collaboration, that by the end of that term, you would see a marked shift in the capacity of your young people with that particular capability. And that could be, if it's creativity, it could be throwing a water bottle on the table and saying, you've got 3 minutes to come up with as many ways to reuse that water bottle. I'm going to reward quantity, not quality. And so have the students work in small teams, or for a collaborative task, you could give them a challenge and put them in a tight time constraint, 7 minutes to complete it, but spend the time unpacking afterwards. What was it about that experience that went well? What didn't go so well? What would you do differently? And also why would it matter to do it differently? But just that whole notion of 10 minutes a week for 10 weeks, and watch the shift in your young people with that focused attention provided on that capability. It doesn't have to be this brand new elective program that you've built in your school that's specifically around skills. Like, all of these things can be infused within the classroom practice from right the way from preppies all the way through to your year 12s, because I think the barrier or the blocker in the conversation is it's always the second question in the room. It's never the first question, but it's the second question that's like, but what about year 11 and 12? Like, what about the ATAR? Like, we can't do all of these things because of the ATAR. And yes, I think some of our assessment instruments may constrain us, but when you walk into that classroom for that 200 minutes a week, like, those learners are ready to learn in front of you. And the how of teaching them that is entirely up to you. The journey that you take to get them to a place where they're ready to complete that assessment doesn't have to be you standing at the front giving them the information. You can reroute that journey where you provide them with a map and you ask them to go through that journey themselves. So I think we have to stop defaulting to an excuse that 11 and 12 stops us from doing the things in the classroom that we want to be doing earlier as well. Any other curly questions?
Somebody asked about the forces of the other forces of change. So just to let you know, when we wrote the report on the New Work Order, I think we said the 3 forces of change were automation, globalization, and flexibility. The 6 forces of change now affecting the future of work and what's being reimagined in workplaces is acceleration of automation, AI, lifelong learning, flexibility, so all the conversations they're having about hybrid work, well-being, diversity, and social responsibility. So they're the 6 that are coming up all the time from the workplace. This is what workplaces are dealing with, thinking about how they're framing the evolution of organizations, institutions around the world, looking at those forces of change. So either they're coming at them. So for instance, from employees, flexibility, well-being, diversity, social responsibility, these things are being absolutely coming at employers from this generation of employees, young people, many of them sort of under 35. And then obviously automation and lifelong learning is kind of what is coming from the supply side in terms of what's happening in business. So very interesting, those forces of change that are being tracked around the world. And our work at WEF, World Economic Forum, is sort of doing a lot of tracking of that as well.
Yeah, super interesting. We'll make sure to collate all of these resources together and send them out to everyone so you guys can nerd out later on all of this research as well. The social responsibility one, to kind of dip into that quickly, is a really pivotal one, I think, Jan, because this is the opportunity for schools and systems to connect the curriculum to life outside the school gates. And I was working with a primary school on the Sunshine Coast last week, and one of their year 2 units has some of their elderly community from a local retirement village come in to speak to the students about the things that they find hard now that they didn't used to find hard when they were younger. And the task for these year 2 students is to come up with an idea that would make Rose or Herbert's life better, easier, or more fun based on the thing that they can't do anymore. And so there's these beautiful little year 2ers that are, connecting to people outside of their school gates and understanding the perspectives of those people. And then they're being privileged and honoured with the space to come up with their own ideas in order to solve it. I kind of think like this is where the magic in learning happens. is kind of inviting the real world into the learning experience. And rather than having them regurgitate the facts back in the right order, ask them to use what they've learned about a topic and apply it in the real world to a situation that, or to help a person that's real life. How do you see that playing out, or do you see that as being something that's significant for schools and systems as well?
Well, if we're talking about, how do we, and I'm always interested in not just sort of preparing young people for the future of work, which I think is kind of a utilitarian, rather reductionist view, but kind of inspiring about life and work and the future. I think it's very telling that even 10 years ago, I remember speaking to the CEO or managing partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the big players around town in consulting. And he said back then, we don't interview grads, they interview us. And one of the first things they'd say is, we know that you do accounting and tax law here. That's why I've got my degree. But actually, what else do you do and how do you contribute to society? And so I think that ever increasing knowledge about the social license to operate is very, very, very real in the minds of every single business and organization around the world. And that's only going to increase. So, that's a positive thing that young people take into the workplace. We should never try to remove that sense of kind of social responsibility and that sense of, and particularly even in little kids, they have this very strong sense of fairness, and we should actually be really, really cultivating that and saying, yes, you're 100% right, and not trying to talk them down and say, when you grow up, you'll understand a lot more. Well, really? Will you understand a lot more? In fact, when I grew up, I understood a lot less about everything, and I still do. So, I think that idea that there is this, very strong sense of fairness in children and young people is actually one of the things that we should really champion about them. And it is interesting that is following them into the workplace, and workplaces there's a lot of pressure on workplaces around some of these things. So there's a direct straight line there, Nick. And the more that we can talk to and help children and young people understand the world, which I don't think ChatGPT is ever going to really be able to do, is how do you understand and how do you become more human, and how does empathy and problem solving and genuinely helping people become so much part of who we are. I think that's, we're all talking about, we're going to have to get very clear about being deeply human in the years ahead. Not that we're not already, but, bringing our humanity and empathy and all those things that actually technology can't do, because we've found out ChatGPT can't love you, is going to be core to what we need to just encourage. And I think that should, in my experience, that's music to the ears of every educator I know. I think I read an incredible story from the Harvard Business Review the other week, which has really, really, really struck me, about a big hospital in the US, like massive, top technological hospital, like brilliant execution at every single thing they do, like being a top tier, school in Australia. And yet their customer satisfaction rating was like 20%. And they're like, how can it be 20% when we're one of the best deliverers of our expertise and knowledge and practice in the work, in the US? And so the CEO went about a program called Bring Your Heart to Work. And they found out that actually over time, because of the stress and obviously being in a frontline environment and all the stress of being in health, and it's not dissimilar sometimes to being in education, that actually, you start to put up shields and barriers to protect yourself. And people were not really bringing their heart to work. They were excellent at the technical skills, but actually had started to kind of distance themselves and disconnect. And so over a couple of months, and only 3 months really, where they started saying, let's put our heart first, because we know we've got the technical skills, and let's really engage with patients and their families in very profound ways, including things like, one guy came in with his wife who unbeknownst to them, had stage 4 cancer, and she was obviously not going to leave the hospital. And he went kind of crazy, just kind of lost it. And security were called, which is what always happens, right? The first thing that happens in every situation, security or the police are called. And a junior nurse, like a brand new nurse, just said to the security, just hang on a minute, and walked up to this guy and said, can I give you a hug?
Oh.
And the guy collapsed into her arms and sobbed for 20 minutes, and then after that said, I can do this, and went back to his wife. And so this hospital started acknowledging and really noticing all these acts of kind of kindness and love that staff were doing, and would really profile and really champion those. Within 3 months, they'd gone from 25% to 95% customer satisfaction. And people were saying things like, how I'm greeted and how I'm treated as a person in this hospital has made all the difference. I know that you're the best at what you do technically, but actually how you relate and how you treat us. And I think about that a lot with parents and students, and the tough times that lots of people are going through, that, yeah, we are asked to be more human, actually not less human, and hide behind all our growing technical skills and technology that separate us from actually our common humanity and love, actually.
Gosh, I feel like that's the perfect way to finish today's session. Is, we know that ChatGPT is going to radically shift the way that teaching and learning and education works. I think it's naive. I think a lot of the time educators have rested on this belief that teachers will never be replaced by technology or robots. But the reality is that if young people can acquire knowledge from something like ChatGPT, then we do have to sit back and ask the question of, well, why do we exist? And what do we bring that moves beyond what technology can currently do? And I think maybe the phrase is like, how do we bring our hearts to our classrooms? How do we show up every day and show up with our heart? But more than that, how do we cultivate the culture and learning experiences that enable our young people not to walk in as empty vessels to absorb knowledge, but actually as open-hearted individuals that are ready to learn more about the world and themselves, and leave each classroom experience knowing the world and themselves a little bit better. I think if we focus there, it won't matter what ChatGPT or any other technology can do, because we'll be creating good humans that can walk out into the real world and do good stuff that makes them happy and hopefully supports other people at the same time. Jan, thank you so much for jumping into live learning. I think we could genuinely speak for the next 45 minutes. I won't, because people have other places to go to. But what I will do is drop a whole bunch of the resources that Jan's also referenced, and anything else that comes up in an email that we'll send out to everybody. Jan, thank you for your time and expertise. If you could leave everyone with one piece of advice, or it could be a reading or a podcast or something to dive into, something curious that they should wrap their brains or their ears around, where would you send them?
Gosh.
Put you on the spot. I can keep talking for a minute and buy you more time.
I've already given all my best stuff at the moment out. I would go back and look at Atomic Habits. I just think if you haven't looked at it recently, I think it's I would go back and have another look at it. I think it's really, get ChatGPT to give you the summary, but it's really good. I think I think it makes everything less overwhelming, to be honest. And I think that's a good thing. So yeah, have a look at Atomic Habits again and see what it might mean for you and personally, and in your classroom and in your school environment and in your leadership roles. And yeah, Peter Hutton owes me massively.
He does.
He is, but you get to have him on another session, everyone. So that's great. He and I would have had a very probably fierce debate, whereas I think this is I think this is a really nice one to get you going. So great to be back again, Nick, and thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's joined. Love seeing you all, a bunch of you who I know, and yeah, please stay in touch. And best,
thanks everybody.
Amazing work. Bring your heart to school.
Bring your heart to school. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us for live learning. We'll shoot off the details for our next live learning, which is actually with Hassan from the SAFE board, and also Pip Cleave, unpacking everything around learner profiles and that work. So if you're curious to dive into that piece a little bit further, then this is the perfect segue into that work. Have a great afternoon. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye.